The storm hit harder than either of them expected. The wind howled sharp and biting as it swept through the mountain pass. The sky had darkened quickly, and the clouds seemed to swirl with a kind of power as if nature itself had decided to test their resolve. Ethan's body ached from the ride, his leg throbbing with every jolt of the horse beneath him. But the urgency of the storm pushed him forward. The two of them rode in silence, the only sounds the howling wind and the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves on the rocky trail. Ethan's eyes darted between Cole and the path ahead, trying to stay focused, trying to ignore the pain in his leg. He had no idea where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. The storm was closing in fast and they couldn't afford to stop. Cole's eyes were sharp, scanning the trail ahead. The man had an uncanny ability to navigate even the most treacherous terrain, and despite the wind and the rain, he kept them moving forward, always at a steady pace. Ethan couldn't help but admire the stranger's calmness in the face of such a storm, the kind of confidence that came from years of experience, from living through storms like this one and knowing exactly what to do. They had ridden for hours, and the storm had only grown worse. The rain began to fall in sheets, cold and unrelenting. It was hard to see anything through the haze, but Cole seemed to know exactly where they were going. He kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, his movements sure and steady. Ethan, on the other hand, was struggling to stay alert. The storm had drained him, his body fighting against the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm him. He had lost track of time, of how long they had been riding or how much further they had to go. All he could focus on was the steady beat of the horse's hooves, the cold air that stung his face, and the distant sound of thunder rumbling in the sky. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Cole slowed his horse and pulled up at the base of a steep hill. The rain was coming down harder now and the wind howled through the trees, but Cole didn't seem fazed. He turned to Ethan, his face hard against the storm. "We're going to find shelter up ahead," Cole shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible. "Stay close." Ethan nodded, his body shaking from the cold, but he didn't argue. He had come to trust the stranger, and he knew that Cole would do everything he could to keep them safe. Together they pushed onward, their horses carefully picking their way up the hill. The storm was making everything harder. The wind howled through the trees, the rain lashing at their faces, and the path up the hill was slippery with mud. But still, Cole moved with ease, his horse finding purchase on the slippery ground as he led the way. Ethan followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest, fighting against the weakness in his legs. It wasn't long before they reached the top of the hill, where a small cave was hidden among the rocks. The entrance was narrow, barely big enough for them to squeeze through, but it was shelter, something they desperately needed. Without hesitation, Cole urged his horse forward, dismounting with ease. He helped Ethan down from his horse, supporting him as they both moved toward the entrance. Ethan stumbled slightly as he entered the cave, his legs still aching, but the warmth inside was a relief. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wild animal, but inside the cave it was quiet. The only sounds were the soft drip of water falling from the rocks and the distant rumble of thunder. Cole started a small fire, his movements quick and efficient, his face set in concentration. Ethan watched him for a moment, grateful for the man's quiet strength. The fire crackled to life, casting a soft glow in the small cave. The warmth spread through Ethan's chilled bones, and for the first time in hours he felt a sense of relief. Cole didn't speak right away. Instead, he moved about the cave, pulling out supplies from his pack, dried meat, a little bread, and some water. He offered some of it to Ethan, and the cowboy gratefully accepted, knowing it was a small comfort in the midst of everything. "Thanks," Ethan said softly, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. Cole nodded, but his focus remained on the fire. He wasn't one for many words, and that suited Ethan just fine. They didn't need to say much. Both men understood the importance of quiet moments, of finding strength in silence. For a while they ate in silence, listening to the storm as it raged outside. The fire flickered between them, casting shadows on the walls of the cave. The warmth of the fire seeped into Ethan's bones, and slowly, the tension in his body began to ease. His leg still hurt, but it wasn't as unbearable as it had been. Eventually, Cole broke the silence, his voice calm but direct. "We'll rest here tonight. The storm's not going anywhere, and neither are we." Ethan nodded, the fatigue of the day finally catching up with him. He wanted to argue, wanted to keep moving, but he knew Cole was right. They couldn't ride through this storm, not in the condition they were in. They had to rest, regain their strength, and wait for the storm to pass. Ethan leaned back against the cave wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the storm outside were oddly comforting. For a long time he had been drifting from one place to another, searching for something he couldn't name. Now as he sat there in the small cave, the fire crackling in front of him and the storm howling outside, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. He had been alone for so long, drifting from one place to the next, never truly connecting with anyone. But now, with Cole beside him, he felt a bond that went beyond words. The kind of bond that could only come from shared hardship, from facing the unknown together. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about the journey they were on together. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cave, Ethan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure where the road would take them or what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just wandering anymore. He had a purpose. He had someone to follow. As the night wore on, the storm slowly began to die down, the wind easing and the rain fading to a soft drizzle. The fire burned low and Ethan felt his eyelids growing heavy. He didn't fight it. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to drift off to sleep. The warmth of the fire and the steady presence of the stranger beside him offering a rare sense of security. Tomorrow would come soon enough, but tonight, they were safe, and that was enough. The night passed slowly, the fire dwindling to embers as the cold mountain air continued to bite at their skin. Ethan hadn't realized how tired he was until the warmth of the fire began to fade. The exhaustion from the fall, the pain in his leg, and the weight of everything he'd been through pressed down on him. And it was all he could do to keep his eyes open. But he didn't dare fall asleep. He knew they needed to keep moving. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they would become. The stranger, Cole, had barely slept. His eyes were sharp, always scanning the surroundings, and he moved quietly, almost effortlessly, as if he was used to being on the move at all hours of the day and night. Ethan had tried to sleep but found himself tossing and turning, his leg aching and his mind racing. The world outside seemed so vast, so empty, and the mountains felt like an endless stretch of stone and silence. When the first light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, the fire had long since died out. Ethan could feel the chill in the air and knew it was time to leave. He hadn't gotten much rest, but there was no other choice. They had to keep moving. Cole was already preparing his horse. He was quick and efficient, moving with a practiced ease that reminded Ethan just how much experience the man had in the wild. Ethan struggled to sit up, his body protesting the effort, but he did it anyway. He needed to be strong. He couldn't afford to let himself fall apart now. Ready? Cole's voice was low, and his eyes were scanning the trail ahead, never settling too long on anything. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he was ready. His leg still hurt, and every movement was a reminder of how far he had fallen, but he knew that staying behind wasn't an option. He couldn't stay in one place, not when there were dangers out there that could find them. There were predators in these mountains, both human and animal. They needed to keep moving. With Cole's help, Ethan managed to mount the horse, though it wasn't easy. His leg throbbed with every shift of weight, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to sit up straight. He wasn't going to let this injury stop him. Not yet. Cole glanced back at him, his face serious. "We'll take it slow today," he said. No rush. Ethan appreciated the man's caution. He didn't want to slow them down any more than he already had, but he also knew that he needed to take it easy. His body was still recovering, and he had no idea how long it would take before he was back to full strength. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to rest too long. They had to get out of these mountains, away from the danger that lurked in the wild. They began to ride, the horses moving slowly along the rocky trail. The air was cold and the wind whipped past them, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path ahead. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the land around them, the vastness of the wilderness stretching out in every direction. It was beautiful in a raw and unforgiving way, but it also reminded him of how small he was in the grand scheme of things. The mountains, the open plains, they didn't care about one cowboy. They didn't care whether he lived or died, but Cole did. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. He had never expected to find someone like Cole out here, someone who was willing to help a stranger without asking for anything in return. He had always been a solitary man, a drifter who kept to himself, but now he realized that there was something more out there, something that didn't depend on the harshness of the world. There was brotherhood. There was the unspoken understanding that, when the chips were down, someone might just ride alongside you, no questions asked. The ride was slow, but it gave Ethan time to think. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, his mind wandering. He thought about the years he'd spent drifting from town to town, working wherever he could find a job, living off the land. It had been a lonely existence, but it was the life he knew. And somewhere along the way, he had stopped questioning it. He had stopped wondering what more there could be. Now, with Cole beside him, something had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something deeper, something about the way the two of them moved through the land, connected by a shared experience. They didn't have to speak much. Ethan didn't even know much about Cole's past. But there was a bond that went beyond words. They rode for hours, the mountains growing taller as they pressed on, the trail winding and climbing higher into the hills. The land was beginning to change, the terrain more rugged and wild, but Cole led them with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Ethan was grateful for that. He didn't have the energy to be lost right now. Around midday, they stopped to rest by a small stream. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was soothing, and Ethan let out a long breath as he dismounted. His leg was aching badly now, and he limped slightly as he moved to sit on a nearby rock. Cole began to unpack supplies from his saddlebag, setting up a small camp. Ethan watched him, still amazed at how easily the man moved. "You've been out here for a long time, haven't you?" Ethan asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Cole paused, glancing over at him. "A while," he said, his tone neutral. He didn't elaborate, and Ethan didn't press. He knew better than to ask too many questions. They were both men of few words, their actions speaking louder than anything they could say. The wind had picked up again, and Ethan pulled his coat tighter around him, the chill creeping into his bones. The day had been clear, but the weather could change quickly in these mountains. They needed to keep moving, but for now they had to rest. Ethan could feel the weight of his leg, and he allowed himself a moment of peace by the stream, letting the cool water soothe his mind. Cole set up a small fire, and they sat down to eat what little food they had left, some jerky, dried fruit, and a bit of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan realized how hungry he was. The ride had taken more out of him than he'd expected, and he hadn't realized just how much he'd been relying on the stranger until now. Cole didn't offer much in terms of conversation, but he didn't need to. There was a comfort in the silence, in the shared understanding that neither of them was truly alone. As they finished eating, Cole stood up and began to pack up their things. He looked up at the sky, and for the first time Ethan saw something like concern flicker in his eyes. The weather had taken a turn. Dark clouds were beginning to roll in, and the wind was picking up. The mountains, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now looked threatening, like they were closing in on them. "We need to move," Cole said suddenly, his voice sharp. "The storm's coming in fast." Ethan nodded, his body stiff with pain but determined to keep up. There was no time to waste. They mounted their horses again, and Cole led the way, riding faster now as the storm clouds gathered overhead. The air was growing heavier, and the wind seemed to push them forward, urging them to keep going. Ethan could feel the storm coming, the pressure in the air, the way the wind howled around them. It wasn't just a storm. It was a warning, a reminder of how quickly things could change out here. They needed to get to safety and fast. They rode hard, the storm bearing down on them, but Ethan didn't feel afraid. With Cole beside him, he knew they had a chance. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about moving forward one step at a time, and trusting that wherever the journey led, they would face it together. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the narrow mountain pass as the two riders continued their journey. Ethan, still weak and in pain, clung to the stranger's back. Every bump and jolt from the horse made his body ache, but he gritted his teeth and hung on. The stranger's horse moved with steady determination, its hooves clattering on the rocky ground as they made their way through the wilderness. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. He had ridden through these mountains many times before, but the night had never seemed so vast. The mountain peaks loomed like silent sentinels, their jagged edges sharp against the night sky. There was something almost magical about the place, something that made Ethan feel both small and alive all at once. For a long while, the two men rode in silence. The only sound was the rhythm of the horses' hooves on the rocky trail and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Ethan didn't mind the quiet. In fact, it gave him time to think, to process what had just happened. He was alive against all odds, and the stranger had saved him. That alone was a miracle in a place as unforgiving as this. After some time, the stranger pulled his horse to a stop, and Ethan felt the movement immediately. The cold air was biting, and Ethan shivered despite the warmth of the stranger's presence. He wanted to ask where they were going or how long it would take to reach safety, but he didn't have the energy. The stranger seemed to know what he was doing, and that was enough for Ethan. He trusted him. The man's voice broke the silence, calm and measured. "We'll stop here for a while. Need to rest and gather our strength. The night's not getting any warmer." Ethan nodded weakly, his body exhausted from the ordeal. His leg throbbed painfully with every movement, but he didn't complain. He wasn't one to show weakness, not even now, not when his life depended on staying strong. The stranger dismounted first, his boots landing softly on the ground. He moved with purpose, like someone who had spent countless nights out here in the wild. Ethan watched as the man started to gather some dry wood, moving through the shadows with an ease that suggested he was no stranger to this kind of life. The sound of wood cracking as the stranger set up a small fire was a welcome relief, the warm light chasing away the chill of the mountain night. Ethan slowly slid off the horse with the stranger's help, his leg giving a sharp protest as he tried to stand. He winced but didn't say anything, determined to stay on his feet. The stranger glanced over at him, noting his struggle. "You all right?" the man asked, his voice still calm but with a hint of concern. Ethan forced a smile, though it felt weak. "I'm fine. Just need a moment." The stranger nodded, not pushing him. Instead, he helped Ethan settle near the fire, where the warmth slowly started to seep into his cold bones. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air as it grew larger. For the first time since the fall, Ethan felt his body begin to relax, the pain in his leg lessening just a little. He let out a slow breath and leaned back against the rocks, staring into the flames. "You're lucky I found you," the stranger said after a moment, his voice breaking the stillness. "This part of the mountain isn't usually traveled. Most folks stay clear of these rocks." Ethan turned his head slightly to meet the man's gaze, still hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. "Why'd you stop then?" he asked. "Why come all this way for a stranger?" The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he tended to the fire, adding a few more pieces of wood, watching as the flames grew higher. Ethan could see the flicker of the firelight on the man's face, but his expression remained unreadable. The cowboy's curiosity was piqued, but he didn't press the stranger for more. In a way, he knew better than to ask too many questions. This man had already saved his life. That was enough. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't leave people behind," he said, almost as if to himself. "No matter what. If I can help, I will." Ethan felt a quiet respect for the man growing inside him. There was something about the way the stranger spoke, something about the way he lived his life that resonated deeply with Ethan. He wasn't just a drifter. This man had a code, a set of principles that defined him, and that made him different from the rest of the world. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan sat quietly by the fire, letting the warmth fill his body as his mind wandered. His thoughts drifted to his past, to the days when he'd roamed freely across the plains before the weight of the world had caught up to him. The land had always been his home, but now, with his leg broken and his body weary, it felt different. The cowboy was no longer sure of the path ahead. He didn't know what came next, didn't know where his journey would lead. The crackling of the fire broke his thoughts, and he glanced over at the stranger. The man was still watching him, though his eyes seemed distant, as if lost in his own memories. Ethan wasn't sure what it was about the man, but there was a quiet sadness about him, a depth of experience that spoke of a life lived with both hardship and loss. Without thinking, Ethan asked, "What's your name?" The stranger looked up at him as if surprised by the question. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and the fire flickered between them. Finally, he gave a small shrug as if the answer didn't matter much. "Cole," he said simply. "Just Cole." Ethan nodded slowly, the name sinking in. He didn't need to ask for more. The cowboy had already given him something far more valuable than his name. He had given him his life. After a while, the two men fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The wind had begun to pick up again, howling through the mountain pass, but neither of them seemed to mind. They sat together by the fire, the warmth and the flickering light their only company. Ethan could feel the fire working its magic on him, easing the pain in his leg, calming the knots of fear and doubt in his chest. As the night wore on, the stars above them grew brighter. The world around them was vast, and the mountains stretched out in every direction like endless waves of stone. For a brief moment, Ethan thought about the rest of the world beyond the mountains, the towns, the people, the life he had left behind. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the here and now. Cole had saved him. And though Ethan wasn't sure where this road would lead, he knew one thing for certain. He would follow this man wherever he went. Wherever the path took them, Ethan knew that he would face whatever came with the stranger by his side. As the fire burned low and the night grew colder, Cole stood up and began to gather his things, preparing for the journey ahead. Ethan knew that he too would need to move on. But for now, as the wind whispered through the trees and the stars gleamed above, the cowboy felt a sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow would come soon enough, but tonight at least he wasn't alone. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of hooves drew closer. His vision was blurry, his mind still clouded with pain and exhaustion. The figure on horseback was now only a few yards away, and Ethan could make out the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, sitting confidently atop his horse. The rider's face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, but even from where he lay, Ethan could sense something steady and calm about the stranger. It was as if the man was no stranger to danger, no stranger to the kind of harshness that defined this unforgiving land. The cowboy's breath was shallow, each inhale sharp with pain. "Please," he muttered again, his voice a weak rasp, barely audible over the wind that whispered through the mountain pass. "Don't let me die here." The stranger's horse came to a slow, deliberate stop just beside Ethan. For a moment, everything was still. Ethan lay on the cold, hard ground, pinned beneath the weight of his own horse, unable to move. He could hardly believe someone had found him, had heard his faint cries and come all this way to help. For a brief second, it seemed like a dream, a faint glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark and desperate situation. The rider dismounted with a fluid motion, his boots crunching softly against the rocky ground. He moved with a kind of practiced ease, as if he'd done this before. Ethan's gaze flickered to the stranger's face, but it was still mostly hidden under the brim of his hat. All he could see were sharp, dark eyes that seemed to be sizing him up, assessing the situation with calm, steady focus. "Hang on, friend," the stranger said, his voice low but firm. There was no panic in it, no rush, just a calm assurance that made Ethan feel, for the first time since the fall, like maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't die here alone. The man knelt down beside Ethan, examining the situation quickly. His hands were sure, practiced, moving with purpose as he surveyed Ethan's injuries. The cowboy could feel the stranger's hands on his leg, prodding gently at the broken bones, but the pain was so intense that he had to clench his teeth to keep from groaning. "Not much I can do here," the stranger muttered to himself, more to the land than to Ethan. He looked around as if searching for something. The sky was growing darker, the sun setting behind the mountains in a slow, fiery descent. The shadows were lengthening and the night was creeping in. Ethan's breath was ragged, his throat dry. "Please," he whispered again, his voice catching in his chest. "I don't want to die here." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave Ethan a long, steady look, as if measuring the weight of his words. For a brief moment, Ethan wondered if the man was even going to help him, if he would just leave him there in the cold, darkening wilderness. The thought of being left to die alone in the mountains was almost too much to bear. But then the stranger spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You're not going to die here. Not if I can help it." Ethan's heart gave a little jump at the words, a flicker of hope rising in his chest. Maybe there was a chance after all. The stranger went to work quickly, cutting away part of Ethan's torn shirt to use as a bandage. His hands were gentle but swift as he worked, doing his best to stop the bleeding from the cuts and scrapes on Ethan's arms and face. Despite the pain, Ethan couldn't help but notice how skilled the stranger was, how calm he was in the face of the situation. "You've been through something like this before?" Ethan muttered weakly, more of a statement than a question. He could tell by the way the man moved that he wasn't some inexperienced wanderer who had stumbled into the wrong place. No, this was someone who knew how to survive in a harsh world, someone who had been on the trail long enough to understand what it took to stay alive. The stranger gave a short nod, as if acknowledging the truth in Ethan's words. "I've seen my share of trouble," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "But I don't leave people to die out here. Not if I can do something about it." Ethan could barely make sense of his thoughts, his mind muddled by pain and exhaustion. But something in the stranger's words resonated with him. There was something about this man, something that spoke of honor and decency. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment he knew the stranger was not someone to be feared, not someone who would leave him behind. There was a bond between them, a silent understanding that passed between the two men. Ethan's chest tightened as he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. I'll follow you, wherever you ride," he said, the words coming out in a rasp. It was the only thing he could think to say, the only promise he could offer this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save his life. The stranger looked down at him for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering light from the small campfire he had just started. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "We'll get you out of here first," he said, his tone reassuring. "Then we'll figure out the rest." Ethan couldn't do much more than nod in response. His strength was fading, his head swimming with dizziness, but for the first time since the fall, he felt a small flicker of hope. The stranger didn't seem in any hurry to leave him behind, didn't seem like he was just going to disappear into the night. For whatever reason, this man was determined to help him, and that was enough for Ethan. The stranger stood up, scanning the horizon once more. The sky had darkened fully now, the first stars of the evening beginning to twinkle overhead. Ethan could feel the cold setting in, the night air biting at his skin. He shivered slightly, his body trembling from both the pain and the chill. "We've got to get moving," the stranger said, more to himself than to Ethan. "Can't stay here. It's too dangerous." Ethan tried to push himself up, but the pain in his leg was too much and he collapsed back onto the ground with a soft grunt. His body felt like dead weight, and for a moment he feared he might lose consciousness again. But the stranger didn't seem concerned. Without hesitation, he moved to Ethan's side, lifting him gently but firmly into his arms. Despite his injuries, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the strength of this man. He had barely noticed how tall the stranger was, or how broad his shoulders were. But now, as the man cradled him, it became clear that he was no ordinary rider. "Hang on," the stranger murmured as he began to lift Ethan onto his horse. Ethan's body protested the movement, but he bit back the pain, forcing himself to stay awake. The last thing he wanted was to slip into unconsciousness again, and lose the only chance he had at survival. With Ethan settled across the horse's back, the stranger mounted his own horse and gave the reins a gentle tug. They rode into the night, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing in the quiet wilderness. The wind whipped around them, but it was a comfort, a reminder that they were alive and still moving forward. Ethan, still dazed but determined to hang on, closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude toward the stranger. This man, who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, had saved him. And somehow, in that quiet moment, Ethan knew that the journey ahead would be one that neither of them could have predicted. "Thank you," he whispered softly, the words almost lost in the wind. The stranger didn't respond, but his grip on the reins tightened. Ethan didn't need to hear anything more. He had made a silent promise to himself. Wherever this rider was going, he would follow. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might just have a chance at life again. Ethan had lived his whole life in the saddle. From a young age, the cowboy had learned the rhythm of the land, the feel of the reins in his hands, the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves on dusty trails, and the never-ending horizon that stretched before him. The cowboy's name was known in many small towns across the West, his face weathered by the harsh sun, his hands rough from years of hard work. But none of that mattered much to him. Ethan was just a man who loved the freedom of the open range, the way the wind would whip through his hair as he rode across the plains. That afternoon, however, the land felt different. There was an odd tension in the air. Ethan could feel it in his gut. Maybe it was just the isolation of the place. the way the mountains loomed like silent giants in the distance, casting long shadows as the day wore on. He had ridden through these parts many times before, but this time something about it seemed off. Ethan's horse, a sturdy bay named Smokey, was usually steady and sure-footed, but today even he seemed uneasy. The horse's hooves clicked nervously on the rocks beneath them, ears flicking back and forth. Ethan patted the horse's neck, trying to soothe him. "Easy there, boy," he murmured, but even his calm voice couldn't shake the feeling in his chest. Something about the place felt wrong. As they moved deeper into the mountain pass, the trail grew more rugged and the air thinner. Ethan's breath came in quick bursts as he guided Smokey through the narrow path that twisted through jagged rock formations. The further they went, the harder it became to see clearly. The sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting an orange glow over the rocks. In that moment, the beauty of the land seemed to take on a more menacing tone. The silence around them was thick, almost as if the land itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, Smokey reared up on his hind legs, startled by something. Ethan tried to calm him, pulling on the reins, but it was too late. The ground beneath them was unstable. Without warning, Smokey's hooves slipped on a loose patch of gravel, and Ethan was thrown violently to the ground. His body slammed against the sharp edges of the rocks, pain shooting up his spine as he collided with the hard, unforgiving earth. Everything went black for a moment. When Ethan finally regained consciousness, the world around him seemed distant, muffled as though he was trapped in a dream. His head throbbed, and the bitter taste of dirt filled his mouth. He tried to move, but the pain in his leg stopped him cold. A sharp, agonizing throb was radiating from somewhere below his knee. He glanced down and saw that his leg was twisted in an unnatural way, bent at an odd angle. His boot was stuck under the weight of his horse, Smokey, who had fallen on top of him, unmoving. Ethan winced as he tried to shift his body, but every movement sent a jolt of pain through him. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. His heart raced as he realized how serious the situation was. The fall had left him pinned beneath the horse, and there was no way to get free without help. He was alone in the mountains, miles away from any town or ranch, with no one around to hear his calls. His mind raced through the possibilities. The sun was setting, and darkness would soon fall. He knew that if he didn't get out from under the horse soon, he might not survive the night. The cold of the mountain would creep in, and the lack of water or food would make things even worse. There was no way to escape, no way to move. His whole body felt like it was on fire with pain. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. "Please," Ethan whispered hoarsely, his voice weak. "Please don't let me die here." His words seemed to vanish into the stillness of the mountains, swallowed up by the vast emptiness that surrounded him. His chest tightened and he felt the panic rising. "I'll follow you wherever you ride." The words were barely audible, a desperate plea as he looked up toward the sky, hoping for a miracle. But deep down he knew there was no one out here, or at least, that's what he thought. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly as Ethan lay there, waiting, fighting against the crushing fear that gripped his heart. His body grew colder and the pain in his leg was becoming unbearable. He tried again to shift his weight, but his leg was too badly injured and he had no strength left to free himself. He was stuck, and every passing minute made it feel more likely that he wouldn't make it out alive. For a moment, Ethan closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the wilderness. There was no noise, nothing except the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, the distant call of a bird, and the faint sound of his own labored breathing. He tried to focus, tried to push the panic aside and think. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be someone, somewhere, who could help him. But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. No one was coming, not unless someone happened to be passing by on the narrow trail, and even then, the chances of them hearing his faint cries over the wind were slim. Ethan felt his hope slipping away. He had no choice but to wait, to hope that somehow someone would find him before it was too late. As the minutes dragged on, the light of day began to fade, and a chill began to settle in. Ethan's mind was foggy, his thoughts disjointed, but one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to die here. Not in these rocks, not alone. He had lived his life with the kind of independence that most people could only dream of. But now, faced with the reality of his situation, he realized how fragile life really was. He wasn't ready to let go. Then, just as Ethan was beginning to give in to the overwhelming darkness, he heard something. Footsteps. At first, it seemed too faint to be real, but the sound grew louder, Was it a trick of his mind? Or had someone actually heard his cries? His heart skipped a beat as the footsteps grew closer. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, Ethan struggled to raise his head, blinking to clear his blurry vision. And there, in the distance, a figure on horseback appeared, a rider, silhouetted against the fading light. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as he saw the stranger approach. His pulse quickened, and for the first time since the fall, he allowed himself to hope. "Please," he whispered again, more urgently this time. "Don't let me die here." The stranger rode closer, his horse's hooves soft against the rocky terrain. Ethan could barely make out the figure, but something about the rider's steady movements and calm demeanor gave him a sense of peace. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. The cowboy held on to that fragile hope as the stranger's horse came to a stop beside him. "Help me," Ethan thought, his voice barely a whisper as he locked eyes with the rider. "Please help me."